Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to 15 with Fosca, the podcast. My guest today is Daniel Grace, who has an incredibly interesting life that we were just talking about before we hit the record button. Daniel divides his time between San Francisco and Panzano and Chianti, where he makes incredible wine, which I've yet to taste, Daniel, but you have just invited me to come
Dude,
visit. You know I'm going to take you up on the invitation. He makes wine at his family's estate, Il Molino di Grace, but he's also a novelist. And we are here today to talk mostly, but not only, about his debut literary thriller, In the Wake of Golgotha. It reimagines, it's got, I don't want to, no spoilers,
no
but
spoilers.
it reimagines ancient myths in the midst of modern day New York City. Thank you, Daniel, for accepting my invitation to be on the podcast. And I can't wait to hear all about the book and everything else that you are doing.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be on the show. And oftentimes, and whether it's video or audio, the first thing I typically start with is I don't sound nor look like a typical Tuscan wine producer. So, a lot of times people they will come into the winery and they say Dove Daniele Grace, and I point to my bald head and my pink Irish skin, and I say it's Grace, but call me whatever the hell you like.
Yeah, well, Tuscan winemakers, I have to say there's a lot of diversity out there.
A
So
lot of diversity,
the,
exactly.
it-
It's not the old days of the fiasco,
exactly.
the beautiful farmers and celloists, and the lovely, gentle rolling slopes. We're an eclectic crew out here.
Exactly. And it has changed quite a bit. So I mentioned in the intro that you do divide your time between Italy and San Francisco. And before we start talking about your book, I really would love to hear your Italy story.
So it's an interesting story, and clearly we have 7 hours for this conversation. So I'm glad you are in for the whole story. But the brief version is, yes, I'm come from an American family, actually with Midwest Ohio roots. Believe it or not, people say, "How did you get into winemaking?" I said, "Well, my father hails from the wonderful wine producing region of Steubenville, Ohio," and I forget to tell people I'm joking. But primarily I actually was born and grew up in London, and had an American family who moved over to the UK in the 60s. And because of our London base in the 70s, 80s, 90s, spent a lot of time in Tuscany and had an incredible opportunity. Just became our home away from home. It was our calling in Castellina and Rada and Greve and Panzano. So it became a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we had the opportunity in the mid 90s to acquire a property out here in Panzano, vineyards first planted by Franciscan monks in the 1500s. There's sort of a pre-Etruscan trail that splits our vineyard that dates back 2,000 years. So humbling, steep history on this steep, rocky hillside. So we came in with sort of this a pretty humble mission just to simply capture the most authentic expression of this majestic soil and magical fruit. And next thing it's almost 30 harvests later, and we're finally figuring it out. And so kind of recognizing we're these temporary stewards of the land for this brief moment in time. And so just committed to returning these hills in better shape than we found it.
What a beautiful story. And also I would just say for those who don't know it, I mean, it's really you've painted this gorgeous picture of one of my favorite places in Italy. And also I think just one, it's just magical. I mean, there's no other word for it. And so how wonderful that you're able to do and how just you beautifully express it. I'm not even going to go further, but you've
You know,
just
it's funny because it's not the wine or the Sangiovese that's intoxicating. It truly is. You spend any time on these hills, and not only is it a spiritual endeavor, but you get sort of drunk with history and culture and wine and music. And as silly as it sounds, like I feel it's just my job just to somehow wrestle and capture that. It's as simple as that. And so we certainly get the benefit of the doubt of nostalgia and charm and yesteryear with sort of just the relationship, especially in the States, with Tuscany. But I think there's a sort of a sharper, deeper, leaner, more sort of meaningful kind of expression of this land that doesn't just rely on kind of the Disney kind of Disneyfied history, if you will. So it's a super interesting moment here in Tuscany for sure.
Yeah, and it really, I love the way you talk about it. I mean, it really feels it's such a mystical place in so many ways. And did you write the book mostly? I mean, I don't know how long it took you to write the book. Did you write it both here and there?
So, these grounds and these hills and kind of the property, that at one point was, kind of anchored in a ninth century watchtower, and it was a hospital and a convent, and so again, charming history. But you realize in the heart of any agricultural land, it's also there's deep, bloody, violent history in this land too that I find fascinating. So yes, Panzano was played an incredible role, just sort of the inspiration of kind of reimagining biblical mythology as well as Roman mythology. And yet, if I'm totally honest, I would say because I'm back and forth to the States so much because of the wine, half the book was written in this romantic way in any dark corner I could find, and the other half is, in airport lounges and in Uber and sitting in sort of, the waiting for a plane in Newark, New Jersey, and all that wonderful stuff. But yeah, certainly a labor of love for sure.
Yeah, it always is, isn't it? So it's your debut novel,
Debut novel.
which I
I
already
had I
mentioned.
had beautiful long hair before I started this process. And again, this is audio, but if you could see me, I've got a shiny bald head. So something happened to my hair in this journey, and it wasn't nothing to do with my three daughters. It was writing this beast of a novel.
First of all, I mean, congratulations, because I think it is a labor of love, and it's something that you put your heart and soul into, and then you release it into the world, and it's huge. And you're someone who's always putting things out, right? But your books are our babies, and already just complimenti because it's already huge to write the book and get it out there. Let's talk for a second about it. How it just came out a few months ago, and it's been receiving incredible reviews. I mean, they're enthusiastic responses to it, which must fill you with joy. Um, Take us a little bit into this world because it is an unusual story, and it is a thriller. And so, just without giving away too much of it, help us step into this world that you've crafted.
Sure. So, sort of the genesis, and I'll get into kind of briefly what the story is about, but the genesis sort of lied in kind of a curiosity and obsession that I had, really, that kind of in looking back at the sort of the end of last century as we came in sort of headstrong into the digital age. I became really interested in sort of this concept of kind of the death of legend, and how we as a modern society and a modern culture, um, legends and heroes and anti-heroes and mythology and comic books, these heroes and anti-heroes were in many ways our moral compass from a literary perspective, and otherwise. And I found it fascinating that these, Shakespearean characters, these biblical characters, these characters of Roman and Greek mythology. And again, it's interesting, kind of the comic book play, because to me, there's no difference between these stories and ones of old. They just became less relevant. And I'm going to go so far as to say irrelevant. So where the story began was sort of a study of this sort of death of legend and this cast of characters who were attending kind of this wake, this death of legend, and what that was sort of attended by these great kind of literary, and mythic and mystical heroes and anti-heroes, one of which was this Judas Iscariot character that I then became incredibly obsessed with, sort of his timeless tumble through history, and then in sort of reconsidering and reimagining kind of the eternal damnation of Judas Iscariot and Pontius Pilate, before I took perhaps a more sort of sympathetic view of, I might argue, upon consideration, there have been, you know, these are two people, real people, indisputably real people, that I might suggest, have been lynched by history and culture and religion. And I started asking questions as to why. And I started to dig deep into kind of their backstory and what was their context relative to this moment atop Calvary Hill, Golgotha. And so that was sort of the kind of the genesis and sort of the origin story about wanting to go down this path of reimagining their sort of not only damnation, but these two characters, their quest for redemption, without challenging biblical history or biblical mythology, in presenting sort of their bloody, violent intersection in modern day New York City with sort of whispers and glances back to ancient Rome and ancient Jerusalem to kind of give their journey kind of context and dimensionality. So not a, certainly not a light summer beach read, so to speak.
You never know. I mean, I'm very intrigued by why, not really why you chose these two characters, but maybe why now? Like, what do you think? I mean, these are two characters, if we want to call them, let's call them characters, but two figures who have been so harshly judged by history, right? Why take them up again now? What relevance do they have in our world today?
So to me, in many ways, this tale of these sort of this modern iteration, incarnation of Judas and Pilate, it's a story of every man and every woman and our collective journey up our own individual hills. And it's a story of crime, punishment, judgment, sentence. And it's really about sort of the sorrow, the pain, the guilt, the fear, the hopelessness, but also the hope, and the love and the stewardship that we carry up that hill, and the judgment that we carry up that hill. And it's also a question of, what is the top of that hill? So this is not a tale that really has anything to do with sort of the Christ character. The title of the book, in the Wake of Golgotha, really speaks to this is about sort of the aftermath of the crucifixion atop that hill, and it's sort of a very dramatic and again, dare I say, dark and pretty violent sort of study of capital punishment and the relationship between religion and the law. And so to me, I think we live in an age, even in considering just the term crucifixion, and we're both based here in Italy, surrounded by, stunning, beautiful, inspiring Renaissance art. And even the narrative of biblical myth and Renaissance art, it's a pretty two-dimensional, strict narrative, and how history
Mhm.
has sort of captured this moment atop the hill and sort of this aftermath. And so to me, there's also an opportunity, and crucifixion is an act, and it's a term that barely escapes the human mouth, yet alone the human soul, and yet it's something that billions of souls, myself included, who wear a crucifix dangling from their neck, often don't necessarily consider the act and the actions and the steps and the sacrifice and the pain that it took to erect that cross, and those souls who have only fallen since his rise, if you will. And so to me, it was just sort of a fascinating juxtaposition of again, this is a literary thriller. It certainly leans more almost Dan Brown and Stephen King as it does biblical. This is not a work of Christian fiction, so to speak. But it does present, I think, some interesting questions that, if one's coming into it from sort of a faith-affirming perspective, I think we're just sort of wrestling with sort of the act and the cast of characters, that maybe we haven't considered sort of what their rise and fall were in enabling and fulfilling the scriptures, right? So I'm not touching the scriptures, right? This is Golgotha, Calvary Hill. These are pretty taboo places, and so
Yeah.
treading on pretty thin ice. And so we're not going there. It's really more about sort of the path of and the context of Judas and Pilate, and these are two characters that have become, in the moment since this violent act atop Golgotha, they've become these sort of abstract adjectives, these sort of villainous, violent verbs that have a very two-dimensional kind of scope. And what was fascinating was, even just in the research, one of the most liberating parts of this process was sort of digging into their backstory and finding out how little we know about Pontius Pilate and Judas Iscariot, not only their lives and their journey to and up Golgotha, but certainly, in the aftermath. And so what was fascinating, there's almost a Mandela effect around Judas and Pilate. Like there's this sort of what we think we know, this kind of their mythology, if you will. And then what's sort of fascinating is having to sort of deconstruct what we thought we knew, because actually it's a blank canvas. And from sort of a creative perspective as an author, that was incredibly liberating to then sort of afford the poetic license, if you will, to kind of create Pilate's weakness and ambition, and kind of craft Judas's sort of rage and revenge and turmoil and sacrifice, without having to contradict history, because frankly, there is no history when it comes to these two characters.
That sounds thrilling. I mean, as a writer, what you've done, I think, is first of all, it's an incredibly ambitious project, um, and it must have been incredibly exciting to find yourself in the midst of these characters and these stories and these moral dilemmas and the relevance. And is there something, though, that while you were writing, was there some kind of a question that you kept grappling with, or something that sort of caused you, and it was something you kept coming back to as you were penning it?
So, to me, it was, the driving idea, especially sort of the sympathetic view of Judas Iscariot. This is not a original thought, so to speak, right? That, heavily inspired by Nikos Kazantzakis' Last
Mhm.
Temptation of Christ. Even in pop culture, in music, whether it's the Rolling Stones and U2, taking this interesting sympathetic role of who had the harder job. Andrew Lloyd Webber, Jesus Christ Superstar, really paints Judas in this same almost sympathetic damned character. Um, but what I found so fascinating again was sort of just in examining kind of the guilt. And when you start going down this path and painting these two characters, and in this story, Judas is sort of cursed with this recurring guilt and awareness of his role and of his actions, and Pilate has kind of a crueler fate in his various incarnations that becomes a dawning reality lifetime after lifetime, and it's sort of this, can often leads to this sort of the suicidal wrestle of history repeating itself. But what I found so fascinating was again kind of that, and not just from myself, but this examination of, how do I say this? There's almost a Freudian tale here of sort of the ego and the id. I'm also a student of Irish literature, and totally obsessed with Samuel Beckett, right? And so if you look at kind of a Waiting for Godot, this sort of tale of Pilate and Judas, this sort of this strength and this weakness, this sort of character of two, this idea of sort of two sides of the same soul, became, a little bit of an aha moment. Then when you start looking at Shakespearean mythology, biblical mythology, Roman mythology, Greek mythology, and again, kind of coming back even to kind of comic books, this idea, the story of the hero and the anti-hero, um, being two sides to the same soul, right? Being this ego and the id, and kind of this aha moment for me, despite sort of the convenient biblical Christian narrative of the roles that they played and why their damnation is deserved because it conveniently fulfilled a broader destiny. Again, was this aha moment of, again, this is a struggle that we all have. This is the struggle of our own strength and weaknesses, guilt and sorrow and hope and hopelessness. And so sort of the universality, which is also the same story, and again, I'm going to paint it with a broad stroke. Every religion and every tale of mythology is a story of a painful struggle uphill that is met with a pivotal, violent moment, right? This is just how, as human beings, this is how we cast divinity, and that's weird and it's fascinating, but it's dark and it's violent, and yet, in many ways, like again, the symbol of the cross has become, this global symbol of peace and tranquility and harmony, as it should be, and that's amazing. But my God, this comes from this violent moment. So a lot of this book, because it takes place primarily in modern day New York, sort of wrestles with, without casting judgment or even picking a side, but this sort of our struggle with crime and punishment and judgment. And the book, it doesn't start, but kind of the pivotal line that was probably the first line that I wrote was this, like, this early ancient Jerusalem exchange. This is fictitious, between Pilate and Judas on sort of this dusty dawn outside Gethsemane, where Judas exclaims to Pilate from his knees, there is no crime to fit this sentence. And Pilate sort of responds, mirroring the statement, saying there's no sentence to fit this crime. So it's just, this is this cyclical sort of cycle of guilt and sorrow and hope and hopelessness that, and again, there's characters that suffering from great addiction in this tale. And, and again, addiction comes in many different formats, and it can everything from, the poppy seed to religious addiction to, addictions of self-harm. And so to me, there's just, I don't know, it just became this, going back to your early question, so relevant because, these are things that we all struggle with, frankly.
Yeah, and it's the universality of this book, and I love how you've drawn on so many different sources of inspiration to construct this tale that is so incredibly relevant right now to what we all grapple with every day, right? I mean, these are questions that we have not been freed of. These are battles that we continue to fight every day. And so I love how you've called upon all these different points of reference, these important texts for you to construct something that helps us make sense of the human condition and why we are the way we are and why we continue, right? The
Right.
cycle. Notwithstanding the lessons of history, if you will, I find it fascinating. And you've said that the book is not comfortable. And I don't think the average modern, reader or spectator likes the idea of sort of going against, the notion of pleasure, especially in today's world. So what that's a dangerous move for a writer to make, but one that I admire because I think discomfort is really important because it makes us question those things even more, right? Pleasure is too easy. It's necessary as well, but it's too easy. So what do you hope that readers do with that discomfort that your book inevitably does create?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, to me, sort of the ambition and the intent of kind of crafting that story was to, and again, whether we're talking about fate and damnation and religion and capital punishment and addiction, these are messy, uncomfortable subjects. And to me, and this is as old as time itself too, there's the tendency to whitewash so much of everything that surrounds us. And so to me, sort of the discomfort really comes into if in considering this moment atop Golgotha, and we can, we can pray silently, we can sit in a confessional booth, we can, mourn our dead, and these are quiet moments. But this is an uncomfortable conversation about, I think, our relationship with faith and with religion. And again, it's not because we're challenging anything, but I think we're sort of acknowledging the reality of the little history we know. And it is dark and it is violent. And that doesn't make it negative or bad. And so the discomfort really comes, I think, from sort of acknowledging, I think, the damnation that we've cast on these. These aren't literary characters that somebody created. These are two souls who played a pivotal role. Whether they were right, whether they were wrong, whether they were cursed, whether they were opportunistic, whether they were selfish or whether they were selfless, who knows? But I think it's worth a conversation, that again, perhaps might it force me to kind of deconstruct the convenient narrative, that I found myself. Again, you and I are the luckiest people on the planet that we can breeze through the Uffizi on a chilly February morning and just be inspired and overwhelmed by this incredible Renaissance art. But I would say, even there's parts in the book, in contemplation of Renaissance art and the Frick collection in modern day New York, where to consider even some of the details in what we think is this beautiful Renaissance art, that really does sort of capture kind of this very violent tradition. And I think there's an uncomfortable relationship between religion and the law. And there's a good amount. The modern day Pontius Pilate character is an attorney who's defending a man who was crucified, three innocent men, and the irony is he's defending this sociopath from the reinstated death chamber in New York. And so part of it is also an examination of even, again, we think there's sort of the separation of church and state when it comes to the law, especially in the United States. And yet there's some fascinating historical breadcrumbs about the relationship, even with the disciples of a group of 12, and the relationship of how sort of the relationship between, that original 12 to the 12 of a jury, and just sort of the numerology around, what is it about this collection of a dozen that can either protect or pass judgment. Just going kind of through the process of, it's a very religious encounter, the moment of death in a capital execution death chamber. And it's just these are things that, without casting judgment, we need to acknowledge we're treading down a very religious path in putting people to death. And to me, there's an irony there. Again, without saying pro or con, either way, and so part of that discomfort is by saying, if we're going to talk about capital punishment, if we're going to talk about addiction, if we're going to talk about religion, it's okay to get messy, right? It's to me, as a winemaker, and I'll stop talking shortly. It's easy to present someone a beautiful glass of wine, and they're sitting in these beautiful Tuscan hills, and you can talk poetry and magic and charm. But to me, I love, exposing the soil, exposing the relationship with immigrant workforces, really exposing, to me, the magic it's the dirty stuff that makes wine so beautiful. And I think that's true with religion. To me, this is the furthest thing from a blasphemous, suggestion or anything anti-religious. To me, this is, religion is dirty. So if we're going to consider it, let's get dirty. And I think there's hope in there, or not, depending on the perspective. But I think it's a fascinating discussion.
I agree 100%. And I want to kind of on a related question, just why did you, or what was it? I mean, this could have been your idea from the get-go, but why set it in contemporary New York as opposed to writing pure historical fiction?
Yeah. So a couple things. The idea, I thought there was an interesting parallel between modern day New York City, a place that I lived for a number of years, a place, where you grew up in the shadows of Manhattan. And so, there's an interesting parallel between modern day New York City and ancient Rome. It's sort of again, the gritty underbelly, perhaps, of a decline of an empire. And not to say I'm taking a pessimistic view. I think that's just the reality of New York City. So I found this moment in time, specifically this moment in time, geopolitically and otherwise, I found there's just sort of an interesting relationship between New York City and ancient Rome in particular. And obviously ancient Rome plays a pivotal role in this story because of its long reach and sharp tongue that extended into Judea. And then the other reason why I wanted to set this in modern day was I didn't want to kind of challenge or recreate a biblical narrative. Not only was I just like, I don't want to touch that. But what I thought was more interesting was to actually start with the aftermath of Calvary Hill and start with sort of that long shadow of the cross that still looms over these two characters. And so the suggestion is that they are suffering this eternal damnation lifetime after lifetime. And they're caught in this cycle of guilt. And this story is really about this moment, this violent, bloody intersection of modern day New York, where these two characters are brought together again after 2,000 years. And it therein presents the opportunity of redemption. Because recognizing, I'm also a student of Jean-Paul Sartre, so it's an existentialist take too. It's about it's kind of the age-old question of choice versus fate. And so when you sort of apply that to Judas and Pilate, choice versus fate, like again, that's a big question, and that's an uncomfortable question. And I think the easy question, well, it's fate. But especially if you think there was choice involved, like that's some gripping stuff just from a human perspective. So
Thank you for raising all of these questions. I think we should be asking ourselves these things, if not every day, we should fairly often. So thank you for that. Something I didn't mention is that you also have a background in advertising. So, these various iterations, right, of your life. So you've told stories through advertising as a winemaker, but when did that moment hit that you knew that you had to write a book? Was it just always within you? Did you always know? Have you been trying for a while?
no, it's I'm someone who's always written per se, and
Mhm.
yes, I owned an ad agency for years, and that's storytelling, being a winemaker and someone who has an incredible opportunity to travel the world to sell and promote my wines. You're a storyteller, right? Wine is the only living organic time vessel, and to me, my job is to kind of these are when you open a bottle of wine, this is these whispers of a time and place and of blood, sweat, and tears of a people who have crafted this. So storytelling. So in many ways, I didn't have to switch any gears. I think, this was certainly among others a story that's been percolating. And as I think, again, surrounded in this incredible land, which I'm so fortunate to spend most of my time in, I'm so acutely aware of history on these hills that I think when you work a land that is so steeped and shadowed in history, and again, you're looking at Tuscany like everywhere else in the world, Florence. You can look at it through sort of a Disney lens, and it's so magical and wonderful. And yet, at the same time, when you peel back the surface of again, whether it's the incredible sort of architecture in Florence or whether it's through the forest floor in Tuscany, again, like everywhere else in the world, there are some dark corners and some dark chapters. And so to me, I loved the idea of, there's there's a two sides to every history. There's two sides to every story. There's two sides to every soul. And so again, I think that opportunity to not necessarily challenge history, but of course, history is not one dimensional, right? It's just the narrative is it's written by the victors, and so we typically only see one side of it. And so to me, there's sort of this daily grind with the fruit and the soil, as silly as it sounds, it kind of gave me the inspiration to sort of wrestle with history. And that's what ultimately this book is. To me, it's a wrestle with a historical chapter that is still relevant today, that I think that shouldn't be taboo. It shouldn't be taboo to tango with history. Why not? And actually, despite the subject matter, like I found it, and people are often surprised when I say this. And again, this book certainly does lean dark, but I found it so fun. Like this was, and again, despite the spiritual, religious nature of it, and maybe I shouldn't say this. We're talking about crucifixion and nails and splintered wood and all that good stuff, but it was really fun to kind of do this dance with history. I was shocked at how I think so much of the time that I had kind of a weird smile on my face. People might say that I need to seek therapy, and maybe I should, but
I don't think so. I mean, everything you've said right now makes perfect sense to me. And, I'm sorry it's not a video episode because the joy on your face tells me everything about how much this book gave you and how much you're giving your readers with this book. And I also want to say that I think personally, we should be dancing a lot more often with history
for
and talking
sure.
about these things. And so I'm grateful to writers like you who are asking the difficult questions. And, I think fiction is always liberating because you can ask those difficult questions, but in a way that is, not disguised, but put in a more acceptable package, if you will, right? Um,
And
so
just to
yeah,
interject really quickly,
yeah,
to me, I find so interesting, what we do as a species and what we've done throughout history in the name of religion is staggering. Um,
staggering.
and we think of that in a historical lens, and again, without necessarily going there, look at what we're doing today, literally today, geopolitically, in the name fundamentally of religion, and it's shocking, our abuse so it's not just sort of challenging a religion, it's also part of that, going back to that discomfort, is sort of this suggestion of what we do in the name of religion, is often so I'll be soft and say curious. And so again, to me, that's part of that relevance today, because I think it's history repeating itself day in and day out.
Absolutely. So, I mean, this book is incredibly relevant to the conversations we should be having if we aren't already having them in light of the current scenario. And I'll just end it there as well. So, it's evident to me that you have so many wonderful stories within you. And I'm going to ask you my final question, which is the question I ask all of my guests. But what's next for you, Daniel?
So, because I can't help it, so obviously continuing down the path of making wine, despite sort of the fragility of the current global wine market, which is a whole different podcast, which we should come back to. I was fortunate to get a two-book deal, and so kind of my my ankles and shins and knees are already deep into the next book, which is kind of an interesting take on it's similar to Golgotha, but it's set against, surprise, surprise, against the backdrop of vineyards, and it's really a tale of sort of timeless, priceless vineyards that contain deep, dark, buried secrets, sort of
Ooh.
juxtaposed to kind of this ridiculously affluent pursuit of sort of cult wines. And so just sort of the dichotomy between the two, it's I'm having fun so far. It's called Territorium, and that's what's next.
Well, that sounds delicious. I mean, that sounds so enticing. I can't wait. I can't wait to read it. I want to thank you for coming on today. And I do want you to come back. I want to talk about the wine industry, and I want to talk about your new book, and I want to talk about In the Wake of Golgotha more. It has been so interesting sitting down with you and learning about everything you've been doing and this wonderful new book, which I encourage everyone to read. And we'll put all of your information on the show notes. And I can't wait to have you back on to continue this conversation and to branch out even more. Thank you, Daniel Grace, for coming on the podcast today.
Absolute pleasure. Piacere.
Grazie, grazie mille.